En un momentito más comenzamos. Estamos dejando que entren las personas, los asistentes. Pues de parte de BFA Global, les damos la bienvenida a todas y todos ustedes. Es un gusto que nos acompañen en la primera edición de las exploraciones del programa Strive México, apoyado por el Centro para el Desarrollo Inclusivo de Mastercard y enfocado en encontrar caminos hacia la resiliencia de las micro y pequeñas empresas, a las que nos referimos como MYPES. Y es oportuno destacar que antier 27 de junio fue el Día Internacional de las Micro, Pequeñas y Medianas Empresas, que se declaró para hacer conciencia sobre la enorme contribución de las MYPYMES a la consecución de los Objetivos del Desarrollo Sostenible de las Naciones Unidas. Y para BFA Global, la atención a las MYPES es una prioridad, como seguramente lo es para todos ustedes y para diversos actores también del sector público, privado y social. Y a lo largo de estos últimos 10 años, BFA Global ha liderado diversos programas dirigidos a MYPES en América Latina, en África y Asia, con enfoque en aumentar su acceso a servicios financieros y digitales para promover pues, más oportunidades económicas, con un enfoque particular en mujeres. Y antes de iniciar nuestra exploración, quiero informarles que tenemos acceso a traducción simultánea en inglés y español. For English speakers, simultaneous translation is available for this presentation. Y quien quiere escuchar la presentación solo en español, seleccione el botón de ese idioma. Y those of you who wish to listen to the presentation in English, please press the English language button. Las personas que sean bilingües podrán permanecer en el canal principal del webinar. Y en el transcurso del evento pueden hacer sus preguntas y dejar sus comentarios en cualquiera de los dos idiomas en el chat. Y entrando en materia, uno de los pilares de nuestro programa es lo que llamamos el Laboratorio de Resiliencia, que está enfocado en establecer una plataforma de interacción con actores del ecosistema como ustedes, para intercambiar conocimientos, experiencias y aprendizajes con un enfoque en los caminos más efectivos hacia la resiliencia de las MYPES. Y es bajo el paraguas de este laboratorio de resiliencia que hemos organizado esta primera exploración. Y las exploraciones tienen la intención de compartir con las y los actores del ecosistema de interacción con MYPES temas que son novedosos, investigaciones recientes y relevantes que a veces no circulan o circulan de manera muy limitada en México y en el resto de América Latina. En esta primera exploración vamos literalmente a explorar la evidencia que existe sobre los impactos tanto positivos como negativos y nulos de la digitalización en las MYPES a través de un mapa de evidencia que comprende un metaanálisis de estudios de impacto que nos pareció sumamente relevante y oportuno pues, compartir con ustedes hoy. Nos acompaña Elise Montano, que es directora de medición y evaluación de la comunidad Strive, que lidera Caribou Digital. Ella estuvo a cargo de la realización y el análisis del mapa. Para la sesión de preguntas nos acompañará también Blanca Aldazoro en representación de Fundación Capital, que también es una institución ejecutora del programa Strive en México. Sin más preámbulo, le doy la bienvenida a Elise. Elise, the floor is yours. Gracias.
Thank you, Gabriela. and thank you for the opportunity to present our evidence map to you all today. For those who aren't familiar with Strive Community, we are a global initiative launched by the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth and Caribou Digital. We're focused on supporting small businesses to build resilience and grow through digitalization. We're focused on micro and small enterprises, that is those with 10 employees or less, and we do this by supporting digitalization efforts in 3 areas: business operations, financial services, and market participation. Core to what we do as Strive Community is understanding the current state of evidence, impact, and best practices globally of digital on small businesses. To better understand the impacts and gaps in the available research, we completed an analysis in late 2022 of the best available literature related to our program, and this formed the basis of our evidence map. So what did we include? We coded more than 700 studies, reports, and articles published primarily in English between 2015 and March of this year. The studies we looked at had to be focused on micro and small enterprises, typically with less than 10 employees, and digital and data-first interventions. From here, we narrowed the literature to just 150 studies that reported a measured impact on micro and small enterprises, in line with the impacts detailed in our program Theory of Change. Finally, we screened these studies against additional criteria to assess their quality and applicability to our Theory of Change, and found 93 that were sufficient for inclusion. For today, we actually found that only 22 of these artifacts were specific to Latin America and the Caribbean, and only 6 had a direct focus on Mexico, highlighting a relative gap in in-depth evidence in the region. Thematically, our evidence map only includes literature that focused on our support areas that I mentioned earlier, and we mapped each study against corresponding intervention types. So, for example, under upskilling and online engagement, we looked at mentoring and training. Under digital business operations, we considered types such as logistics and delivery tracking support or inventory management. We then plotted all the evidence we found against the 7 outcome and impact dimensions from our Strive Community Theory of Change. We looked at outcomes that tend to be short-term in nature, such as small businesses adopting best practices, digital products and services. We looked at medium-term impacts, like enhancing business resilience and increasing efficiencies. And we looked at long-term impacts, like business growth and the creation of new work opportunities. The outcome of this analysis is our evidence map tool. Once it's live at the end of next month, it will be the only public interactive tool that charts the evidence of digital and data-first interventions on small businesses globally. It shows the positive, negative, and null impacts from the 93 studies and allows users to identify and interact with the research and filter for different sub-themes that are relevant to their programs, for example, by different types of interventions or different regions, and to easily visualize where there are gaps in the evidence base and more research may be needed. One of the really exciting things the evidence map lets us do is ask questions like, what does the evidence say about digital and data-first interventions specifically for women-owned MSCs? Or what type of training programs have the strongest impacts on an outcome like revenue growth? For today, the main question we asked of the evidence map was, what does the evidence tell us about how to support small business resilience in Latin America? The first thing that we found when we consulted our evidence map was that bundled interventions were in fact an effective means of achieving long-term outcomes. In Latin America, the vast majority of studies we looked at involved combinations of interventions that mix different forms of support that we focus on in Strive Community. For example, they might combine digital financial services with access to new tools or apps that facilitate business management, or they may combine access to new digital marketplaces with upskilling programs. One of the things, though, that we did find was that digital financial services were by far the most commonly studied intervention type, and upskilling the least, with almost 70% of studies including some element of DFS, whereas less than 10% included upskilling. When we looked at our 7 impact dimensions, we found that the evidence from Latin America is well researched on all areas. However, the impacts of digital on work creation and advancing capabilities has relatively few studies associated with them. Resilience, though, was the most commonly researched outcome area in Latin America. This correlates to our global analysis, which also showed resilience to be one of the more commonly researched impact dimensions. Interestingly, however, at a global level, business growth was also a major area of research, yet in Latin America, it appears to be significantly less common in the evidence base. As we found in the global evidence base, the evidence of digital and data-first interventions documents positive results. Overall, digital has overwhelmingly positive impacts on micro and small enterprises in Latin America. You'll notice from the graph on this slide that the short-term adoption of new best practices associated with digital is the most common positive outcome for small businesses, indicating a real wealth of evidence supporting short-term changes within small businesses. However, we also find that there's relatively little evidence of negative impacts on small businesses across all dimensions. This is somewhat surprising to our team because we know that there are potential risks and harms associated with digitalization for small businesses and that they're fairly well documented. This may include risks associated with navigating new digital tools or the potential for digital to widen inequality between segments of small businesses. We feel that this lack of null or negative evidence may actually speak to a hesitancy among practitioners to show these impacts, rather than the fact that the impacts do not exist. More than 80% of the studies included in our evidence map came from practitioner-led gray literature, where programs may have more hesitancy to speak publicly about negative and null impacts of their interventions, as opposed to rigorous randomized tests that tend to report the good, the bad, and the ugly. When we start to look at our different support pillars, we started with digital financial services and found that access to credit has been a primary marker of financial resilience throughout the evidence base since 2015. This has continued to be the case during COVID-19, where small businesses across Latin America increased their use of credit products, and those products played an important role in providing liquidity for small businesses during that period of upheaval. We also know from research led by Strive Mexico that only about a third of small businesses nationally have access to formal credit. Regionally, a deep dive into the Latin American fintech ecosystem, led by the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, found that the vast majority, about 64%, of small businesses in Mexico are using loans to provide working capital for their business, which provides them obvious benefits for resilience. However, the same study also found that over 90% of small businesses surveyed saw one or both of profits and turnover stay the same or increase after taking up a new credit product, suggesting that digital financial services also plays a crucial role in revenue growth. Non-financial elements of resilience are less commonly measured in the evidence base. However, we did find some evidence that DFS are linked to broader investments in multidimensional elements of resilience, including satisfaction and business survival rates. For example, a study from IFC of Brazilian female entrepreneurs found that women who adopted digital financial services reported positive and significant levels of satisfaction with their business performance after adopting new digital financial products. Another study found that 30% of Latin American small businesses who experienced mandatory closures during COVID-19, the vast majority, 27 out of the 30%, managed to reopen, indicating a relatively high survival rate during the pandemic linked to access to credit. We also looked at the uptake of digital business management tools that support things like delivery services, financial or inventory management, accounting. We found strong evidence, again, that digital tools support efficiency and resilience globally as well as in Latin America. When used effectively, digital tools support small businesses in particular to adopt new best practices that ultimately allow them to be more efficient and to do more in less time. In Latin America specifically, we found evidence from DAI that small businesses increased their use of digital tools during the pandemic. But Mexican small businesses actually lag quite significantly behind regional trends. Only 57% of small businesses in Mexico in 2021 reported that they had used some kind of digital tool in the last 30 days, compared to significantly higher rates in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. The same study also found that micro enterprises are less likely to have used digital tools than small enterprises, suggesting that the smallest businesses are missing the most potential. The tools that Mexican small businesses are using can be considered relatively low stakes, in that they're often digital tools that business owners are already using in their personal lives, and expanding that use to business purposes does not require a significant investment of time or effort. However, use of more advanced tools like inventory or financial management apps appears to be quite low in Mexico specifically and across Latin America more generally. There are very limited studies looking at this. However, one small-scale study that we came across, shown here, suggests that Mexico lags behind other countries in Latin America, both in the use of high and low-stakes tools. Yet at a global level, there are many studies that have found that these familiar tools are important gateways to deeper digitalization for small businesses. They create pathways to engage these businesses where they're already comfortable and present to gradually build trust and familiarity with more advanced digital tools. Despite the relatively low uptake of more complex tools, we know that the current usage has been essential to innovation and resilience since the onset of COVID-19, globally as well as in Mexico. Nationally, of those small businesses that are already digitalized, almost 70% reported that digital tools were either important or essential to keeping their business running during COVID. This included platforms that enabled delivery for retailers or food and beverage enterprises, and messaging, email, and social media tools that facilitated better remote communication with customers, allowed small businesses to coordinate with suppliers, or to manage employees that are now having to work remotely. When we looked at our third pillar, that being digital marketplaces and digital market participation, we found that use of social commerce grew by about 15 percentage points on average across Latin America during the pandemic. In Mexico, an estimated 40% of small businesses were using social commerce during the pandemic for either or both marketing and sales. From the global evidence review, we know that social and e-commerce are linked to resilience and growth for small businesses, although data in Latin America is less present. In general, the adoption of social or e-commerce has led to self-reported improvements in revenue globally, between 20 to 50% for small businesses, as well as fewer negative impacts to revenue reported during the pandemic. Participating in digital marketplaces allowed small businesses to stay open, cover expenses, maintain or improve their profit trends, and access new and wider customer bases that they simply were not able to before they went online. The final area of our approach that we looked at is the role of digital upskilling. At the global level, we found that digital upskilling can lead to short-term improvements in MSE outcomes. Typically, that's improved capabilities or adoption of some new practices. However, there's a real lack of robust evidence specific to Latin America on the impacts of digital upskilling in the long term. This is another gap in the research that we find would be really interesting to dig into more in the future. However, what we do know from the global literature around upskilling is that it is most effective in that it leads to long-term outcomes for small businesses when it's bundled with products and services like credit products, digital tools, or access to marketplaces that allow businesses to tangibly implement their new capabilities. In particular, upskilling is most effective for long-term outcomes when it is focused on teaching better marketing practices that enable customer acquisition and research and analytical skills that allow business owners to make use of the data and analytics that are being provided by digital marketplaces or new apps that they're using. It is also important to note that we did find differences at the global level on the impact of digital and data-first interventions between women and men-owned small businesses. Digital programs that are not gender intentional can actually worsen gender inequality. Men tend to benefit more from digital interventions across all outcomes measured unless the approach is tailored specifically to women business owners. This can usually be done by addressing the barriers to women's trust and understanding of new products and services, and addressing the social and cultural norms that restrict women's ability to participate in new marketplaces. So while these are the main findings from our evidence map, we've also found some quite significant gaps in the evidence. When we look at the Latin American literature base specifically, I think we see 4 things. First is that there's a general lack of rigorous and high quality evidence focused on small businesses. Our evidence base includes a lot of practitioner and grey literature, whereas we would love to see it built out more in the future with methodologically robust studies that test interventions and different combinations of interventions so that we can better identify the individual levers that promote change. Secondly, we found that while there's a large focus on resilience in the general literature, and definitely a focus on financial resilience, a multidimensional concept of resilience is not very well measured yet. Third, we found very little evidence on the impact of digital upskilling in Latin America, be it positive or negative impacts. There's not as much evidence out there on training and mentoring programs for small businesses as we have found in other regions. Finally, similar to what we found at a global level, in Latin America, there's very little evidence linking digital interventions to the creation of work opportunities within small businesses. Again, be this positive, negative, or null impacts, there's just not much out there linking digital to work creation. So to conclude on what's next for our evidence map, we will be publishing it online shortly and then updating it annually with new research and evidence, as well as new analysis from our evaluation and learning team. As the Strive Community Program, we will be using it to ask and answer our own programming questions and dig deeper into specific analysis, but we will also be inviting others, like the people who are on this webinar, to contribute yourselves, to get involved, submit your own evidence, and use the tool to support your own programming. We look forward to building this out in the future so that it is a valuable tool for the entire small business support community. Thank you for your time.
Elise, muchas gracias por tu presentación, muy interesante. Ahora me gustaría continuar la conversación contigo, aprovechando tu profunda experiencia en este espacio, y también invitar a Blanca a sumarse a la conversación, aprovechando también su amplio conocimiento del mercado mexicano en particular. Y para todas y todos los asistentes, por favor, les reitero que hagan sus preguntas o dejen comentarios en el chat. Pues bueno, ahora, Elise, tu presentación de la evidencia existente destaca muchos impactos positivos de la digitalización en las micro y pequeñas empresas en América Latina, lo cual es excelente, pero dada la cantidad limitada de estudios realizados en una región tan grande como la nuestra, ¿cuáles son algunos ejemplos de impactos negativos que la digitalización ha tenido en las MYPES? ¿Y qué tipos de actores deberían ser particularmente conscientes de ellos?
So the truth is there's very little specific evidence of negative impacts observed in many of these studies. And even where we've seen negative impacts, sometimes it may not be that digital per se caused that outcome, but rather a negative impact or result occurred within the context of a digitalization intervention, and we can't pick out if it was caused by the digital bit or the analog bit. However, some of the big themes that we found around negative impacts are that firstly, we also know that, or we know that when it comes to digital marketplaces in particular, the platformatization of markets can be a real double-edged sword for small businesses. It provides opportunities, but also can lead to risks like increased competition, discrimination, concentration, risky and predatory practices, all of which can be harmful for small businesses. There's emerging research out there that we've come across that has pointed to an actual tendency within digital marketplaces for small businesses to apply some of these predatory and risky business practices themselves in order to establish market dominance. So that might be that they start selling at a loss or stockpiling inventory in order to drive competitors out. There's a real lack of evidence around the medium and long-term risks and costs associated with these practices for small businesses, but it's an area of harms that we'd love to see more research around going forward. I think the second big area of negative impacts that we sort of come across is the risk of digitalization worsening the gap between MSEs that are and are not digitalized, and between other segments like male and female-owned small businesses. And this can happen for many factors, differences in access, cost, knowledge, need, interest, that are often linked to social and cultural norms that define these different segments. However, it does open the possibility that the benefits of digitalization are coming at the expense of small businesses that aren't digitalized. And we really need to do more as a support community to ensure that the benefits of digitalization are shared and don't worsen inequality between different segments. One particular segment to look out for here that we have found in the literature is in countries where there's a large number of informal MSEs, many of the effective solutions that we came across require a strong digital financial infrastructure. So this includes things like access points, mobile phones. Many small businesses, especially informal ones, still may lack the documents such as government-issued identity cards, digital means of payments, all of those things that are required to really get into using more advanced digital services. And they may be left behind by these sorts of initiatives going forward.
Muchas gracias, súper interesante. ¿Tienes alguna idea de cuál sería la mejor manera de evitar estos resultados, esos potenciales resultados negativos?
So I think some of it comes down to segmentation and making sure that you're aware of who you're working with and what your objectives are for working with those different groups. So for example, if your strengths lie in working with small businesses that are already on the digitalization path. But then I think another bit of it relates to, particularly on the market side, working with platforms to make sure that they are not encouraging or promoting some of those risky practices that we're seeing, so that there's space for more businesses within the platform. But it really requires a layered approach where we're not just working with small businesses, but we're also working with the financial service providers, the platform providers, the tool providers, to make sure that what they are developing is also relevant and is also in the best interests of the small businesses in their communities.
Muy interesante, y por eso la relevancia de poder presentar este tipo de información al público en México y en América Latina más ampliamente. Y Blanca, ahora contigo, en tu experiencia, ¿hay sectores o industrias específicas en el entorno de la digitalización de MYPES en México que hayan propiciado impactos positivos significativos e impactos quizás menos positivos o hasta negativos en ellas que tú conozcas?
Sí, bueno, primero que nada, buenos días a todos. Un gusto estar aquí y en nombre de Fundación Capital, gracias por la invitación a BFA Global. Pues mira, más que industrias en particular, lo que vemos son segmentos de empresas, ¿no? Las más pequeñas son muy vulnerables. Me resulta súper interesante este estudio, ya muero de ganas de poderlo leer completo, porque como mencionó Elis, no es que no haya efectos negativos, es que no están suficientemente documentados, ¿no? Y pues es raro que no estén tan evidenciados cuando estamos hablando de innovación, y la innovación necesariamente implica beneficios y oportunidades, pero también costos, riesgos y retos diferentes, ¿no? Entonces, evidentemente, si existen esos riesgos, tiene que haber algunos impactos negativos, desafortunadamente, y simplemente nosotros lo vemos en la operación. Cuando tú estás invitando a las MYPES a subirse al sistema financiero digital, pues conocemos que hay muchos beneficios, que van a crecer su negocio, que necesitan este tipo de herramientas para poder utilizar las otras de tecnología, pero también que quedan expuestos a fraudes cibernéticos, a robos de identidad, a clonación de tarjetas, a un mundo digital que a ellos les cuesta trabajo poder conceptualizar. Creo que si a todos nos cuesta trabajo, y es lo que utilizamos pues con más frecuencia la tecnología, a la MYPE que está más lejos, le resulta todavía más complejo, ¿no? ¿Qué pasa cuando empiezan a aceptar pagos digitales y resulta que se expusieron a tarjetas clonadas, por ejemplo, ¿no? ¿Qué pasa cuando se suben a querer entrar en los mercados digitales y a poder hacer comercio electrónico? Y tienen que enfrentar una serie de retos para los que se tienen que preparar de manera anticipada. De los casos más interesantes que me tocaron ver fue mujeres indígenas en Chiapas, alfareras. Entonces tú puedes decir, ah, sí, bueno, cualquiera tiene retos de vender por internet. Sí, pero a ver, piénsate cómo vas a embalar artesanías de barro, ¿no? ¿Y qué pasa si esa pieza llega rota o llega raspada? Ya no vale lo mismo. Y estamos hablando de piezas que son muy costosas. Entonces, esa MYPE que se está arriesgando al comercio electrónico, esas mujeres, además indígenas, con una serie de restricciones por normas sociales, etcétera, queriéndose subir al comercio electrónico y necesitando verse beneficiada de todo lo que esto produce. Pero ¿qué pasa si sus piezas llegan rotas y ya no se las pagan, ¿no? Y ese riesgo, ese costo lo tienen que asumir ellas. Y eso se lo están enfrentando todos los días. Entonces, evidentemente sí hay esta parte de riesgos y de alguna manera tenemos que estar conscientes todos los que trabajamos en este ecosistema de qué manera les generamos herramientas para poder gestionar pues de mejor forma estos riesgos, ¿no?
Sí, súper interesante y muy en tema, ¿no? Aquí llegó una pregunta del público, Elis, que dice que si los documentos revisados en México y América Latina fueron financiados por donantes o sponsors que posiblemente tengan agendas específicas y por lo mismo el enfoque temático y en resultados positivos, o sea, en enfoque temático dice pues el financiamiento, ¿no? Que como ese es un tema de interés para muchos, pues eso es lo que financian. Sí eran estudios financiados por donantes o capturan esa información.
So in some cases they were, and I would say that probably about half to 2/3 are what we consider practitioner-led gray literature. So that is studies that are written by programs themselves that are usually donor funded. So that certainly has an influence on what we find in the evidence map. But about, or a little bit more than 1/3 of the evidence in there is quite rigorously studied non-donor funded academic literature. And when our evidence map is published, it is one of the filters that you can filter by. You can choose to see only the sort of third-party independent research or the entire body, so that you're able to decide sort of what your level of rigor in terms of how you want to interact with the research, where it falls. In general, we didn't see significant differences when you compare between the independent third-party studies and the overall sort of evidence map. However, obviously the overall evidence map has significantly more points in it and sort of can skew some of the results. But it's certainly one of the things that we were sensitive to in the analysis process and tried to code everything against so that we're aware of where any potential bias may lie in the evidence base.
Great, thank you. And well, as part of your research also, oh, let me turn back to Spanish. I was asking Spanish. I'm sorry. ¿Qué tienen en común las iniciativas de digitalización más exitosas, independientemente del tipo o contexto o segmento al que vayan dirigidas?
So I think that there's no clear single route that wins as the sort of best way to generate positive impacts for small businesses. In relation to digitalization initiatives, we know, though, that there are a few different pathways that seem to be more successful than others. And this really seems to boil down to two. The first is initiatives that address marketing skills and different ways for small businesses to acquire customers and engage with them. So that can be through training programs that build up those skills, or the provision of new apps or services that allow small businesses to market to or engage with customers more efficiently. So if you think that could be apps that allow them, like social commerce apps that allow them to engage directly with customers and do more of it faster, or it could be different apps or products that allow them or financial services that allow them to upscale their paid marketing or advertising, reward systems that really just allow them to do more, acquire more customers, and then eventually expand the size and scope of their sales. That's the first main pathway we've seen from the evidence. The second pathway is one that we find quite interesting and potentially a lot more novel. It's looking at data and analytics. And again, here, there's different ways of doing it, but basically it's about building up access to and skills for research and data analysis, or providing apps or tools that do that for small businesses. So that can be management apps or financial services that make better use of or present data more clearly for small business owners to use in their decision-making processes. Again, these interventions tend to have a high correlation with positive impacts for small businesses. And it's regardless of the country we're looking at or the type or segment of MSE or intervention being evaluated. That's another pathway that we kept sort of seeing come out again and again from different bits of the literature base.
Y aquí la segmentación es también muy importante, porque la manera de presentar los datos para diferentes niveles de microempresas, pues debe de adaptarse a cómo entienden esa población los datos, ¿no? Como, o sea, una gráfica de barras no a todo el mundo le dice algo, ¿no? Entonces ahí también la importancia de segmentar. Y ¿tienes en mente algún par de estudios, nos puedes decir algún par de estudios destacados que respalden esta afirmación de que la digitalización contribuye a la resiliencia y a la eficiencia o el crecimiento de las MYPES?
Sure. I mean, there's a few in there that you can dig into, that anyone can dig into once it's published, but I think a few that jump to mind for me, there's a randomized control trial that was conducted in China with about 2 million small retailers. And it looked at the role of training and marketing combined with data analytics, paired that with seller data and trainee feedback to show a wide range of benefits on small businesses that had access to the different sort of combinations of the training offer and the data platform. And it showed significant improvements in their revenue growth over a 2-year period, I believe. We've also included a study from Rwanda. It's an upcoming RCT. It's not officially published yet, but hopefully by the time it's on our evidence map, it will be. that was able to link the use of business apps to increased sales, profits, and quite interestingly, analytical abilities for the small business owners involved, and really trace that quite robustly. Then we also found some studies that looked at what you'd probably say are more traditional pathways, so like with the provision of credit. As I mentioned earlier, there was the deep dive into the Latin American digital finance sector led by the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance. That looked at the relationship between different forms of digital financial services and business growth, resilience, and efficiency across several countries. And it had some really interesting findings about how credit products are being used by small businesses. I think the final study I'd point to of interest, it doesn't so much look at the impacts of digitalization for small businesses, but DAI did a fantastic series of reports published last year that looked at 13 different countries around the world, Mexico being one of them, and the impacts of COVID-19 on digitalization. It's a great starting point for understanding the current state of play in Mexico or other countries, and the really powerful role that digitalization is already having on small businesses, although it doesn't take that next step at looking at, and then how does that impact on resilience and income and work creation. But it really speaks to the sort of uptake and capabilities side of what we're seeing happen right now in the sector.
¿En qué medida, o sea, hay suficiente evidencia que nos pueda decir si estos caminos o sea, estos caminos hacia el impacto de la resiliencia son específicos a un contexto o si tienen algunos elementos que son aplicables de manera más amplia a otros contextos?
Yeah. So there's, in some ways, probably still not enough evidence to really say whether something is specific to that context or truly a global finding. There's certainly trends that we're seeing, but what I think is important is more what we see in the design of different interventions and the way that is needs to be tailored to a specific context or a specific segment. So, making sure that the intervention is really localized to the small businesses that you're working with, making sure that it is relevant to the sector, the segment, the characteristics of the people that you're trying to work with. Another one is interventions that tend to be very direct in how they reach small businesses, that are recognizing they're short on time, they're short on sort of bodies in the business to get things done, and are respectful of that. So they're coming in with quick tips and advice. They are not 1 week long training courses that take them away from the business. They're bite-sized, they're delivered where small businesses are at. Those are some universal things that we see across all different kinds of initiatives. But then when you start to get into the sort of more really detailed specifics, it tends to be quite specific to the individual intervention, the country, the segment that you're looking at, because the characteristics that make up that segment are so different in each case.
Okay, great. Thank you. Y pues ahora les quiero hacer una pregunta, pues, casi final, tanto a ustedes dos como a la audiencia también. Pueden seguir usando el chat para la audiencia, pueden poner sus comentarios en el chat, ¿no? Y aquí lo que quiero preguntar es, ¿cómo consideran ustedes que las organizaciones del sector público, privado y social, cómo pueden aprovechar este mapa de evidencia para informar sus estrategias y apoyar los esfuerzos de digitalización de MYPES de manera efectiva? Siendo que si no todas las personas que estamos aquí nos dedicamos a eso, pues me parecería interesante conocer su opinión al respecto. Blanca, si quieres empezamos con...
Yo creo que sirve en primera para concientizar, ¿no? Y estar todos claros que no se trata nada más de facilitar el acceso a la tecnología, acercar la tecnología y ya, sino que pasa por este proceso de brindar información a la MYPE, desarrollarle las capacidades digitales para poder aprovecharla y después poder hacer un proceso de adopción mucho mejor informado, mucho más consciente, poderles anticipar cuáles son los puntos de fricción, poderles generar estrategias para gestionar los riesgos. Entonces, a partir de que entramos como en este análisis, ponemos el foco en evidenciar que existen costos, riesgos. No hemos hablado un poco, pero también está el tema de la formalización versus la informalidad, que mencionó un poquito Elis. Es decir, quiénes van a estar más expuestos o menos expuestos, ¿no? Los formales versus los informales, pero también los más pequeños versus los más grandes, los más cerca de la tecnología o no. Entonces, tener claro esta segmentación también me parece importante, porque también es cierto que esos más pequeños son los que se pueden ver más beneficiados. Entonces, para mí sería, en primera, podemos aprovechar para hacer esta reflexión y tenerla en el radar. Segundo, para hacer diseños de procesos de inducción mucho más robustos, ¿no? En donde contemplemos este proceso y contemplemos también y concienticemos esto otro que mencionaba Elis, de intervenciones combinadas. De pronto veo que hay como una expectativa de que por una intervención el microempresario va a hacer un proceso de adopción casi de inmediato, ¿no? Y es difícil que sea así. Hay que tener esta conciencia de que un proceso de transformación digital va a llevar 2 o 3 intervenciones por lo menos, y de eso tenemos que estar conscientes y nos ayuda este mapa a decir, ¿quieres tener un mayor impacto? Vamos a ir cruzando estas intervenciones, ¿no? Vamos complementando. Y el otro aspecto que me parece súper importante que se resalta aquí es el tema del lente de género. Siempre hablamos de centrar nuestras estrategias en el cliente final, en sus necesidades, en entender muy bien cuáles son sus motivaciones, pero también cuáles son los costos, los riesgos que enfrentan ellos en su entorno y en su realidad. Pero es súper importante que además de ese centrarnos en el cliente, particularmente hagamos la reflexión del ente de género y de las diferencias que existen pues entre hombres y mujeres y en su proceso de acercamiento a la tecnología, y lo mencionó Elis, las mujeres enfrentan más retos, ¿no? Entonces necesitamos también estar conscientes de eso. A mí entre las cosas que más ruido me han causado es hablando con los proveedores de tecnología y me decían su fuerza su fuerza de venta, me decía, no, yo me espero a que llegue el marido, porque las mujeres son bien complicadas. Entonces, si yo hago un negocio y está la señora, mejor me espero. Y yo, ¿cómo? Entonces, reconozcamos estas diferencias, respetemos que la mujer toma decisiones de manera diferente, reconozcamos que tienen otro tipo de preocupaciones y necesidades y hagamos los procesos de digitalización pues con este lente de género, ¿no?
No, muchísimas gracias. Y Elis, ¿tú cómo crees que los diferentes tipos de sectores, el privado, el público y el social puedan utilizar este mapa?
Yeah. So I think that there's probably really 4 things that we need to keep in mind going forward. I think that we need to acknowledge that obviously digital is a force for overwhelming good. There may be negatives associated, but the evidence, you know, even if we got better at reporting the negatives, we know that there's a lot of evidence out there about the good that digital brings to small businesses. I think that we have a role to play now in looking at how we can better segment our approaches to ensure that we're addressing the right kinds of things with the right small businesses, that we're taking the right approaches, and really that non-digitalized firms or that women-owned firms or indigenous firms, informal firms are not being left behind, and that we're not making those gaps worse because of how we're implementing programs. And I think that having a tool that allows us to dig into what sort of evidence exists on that, even if it's not necessarily able to say, this is absolutely the right thing to do, it is able to sort of pinpoint examples where interventions have been done that look at some of those different segments and are able to sort of at least pose some good advice. I think we need to get better at doing that. Secondly, I think we need to get better at pairing more advanced digital financial products with business management tools, so doing more bundled approaches to build on top of what MSCs are already doing and deepen their digital journeys. I think for a lot of small businesses, it isn't so much a question of going digital as it is about maximizing potential for digital and making it easier to find, trust, and access the right tools to sort of make that deepening process easier. Then, as I was saying earlier, I think we need to build skills in small businesses to make it easier for them to focus on marketing, customer engagement, and building their audience. And that includes things like non-traditional skills, when we think of small businesses, like research and data analysis, so that they get better at understanding their customer base and using data to fine-tune their engagement and selling strategies. I think there's a lot of potential there for us to make big step forwards with relatively small amounts of effort. And then finally, I think the last thing for us to think about as a sector is getting a lot better at becoming rigorous in how we test our interventions, documenting the impacts, being more transparent about where we see negative and null impacts, even when it's a donor-funded study, being allowed to put things out there, warts and all. It helps the entire sector build a more nuanced understanding, not only of what works, but what combinations or isolated parts of interventions are the most essential at getting to those key growth and resilience outcomes for small businesses. We all want to know this, but we all tend to guard our information quite strictly, and we would be so much better off if we were able to put that information out there transparently and allow others to learn from it. I think that we've got a lot of potential, and we just need to get better at showing everything to the world.
Totalmente de acuerdo contigo, y creo que también es una llamada a los donantes y a todos los que financian este tipo de programas de permitir que haya honestidad en esas evaluaciones del impacto que están teniendo las iniciativas. Obvio, todos los que estamos involucrados en estas iniciativas de digitalización de micro y pequeñas empresas y que buscamos en particular caminos hacia la resiliencia de las mismas, también tenemos que ser honestos sobre qué funciona y qué no funciona, y que los financiadores de estos esquemas pues también estén abiertos a que pues son hipótesis. Todos estamos haciendo nuestro mejor intento en lograr un buen impacto en las micro y pequeñas empresas, pero pues a veces nos quedamos cortos por diversas razones, y el tener una agenda robusta de aprendizaje me parece que es importante para pues diferentes programas que buscan apoyar a las micro y pequeñas empresas. Y pues para finalizar la conversación con ustedes, ¿alguna recomendación o advertencia final para impulsar iniciativas de digitalización relevantes y exitosas? ¿Unas últimas palabras que quieran mencionar? Blanca.
Pues yo reforzaría esta importancia de tener procesos de inducción robustos, en donde anticipemos los puntos de fricción para los microempresarios, ¿no? Si bien las posibilidades de que incurran en estos riesgos son bajas, me parece que tenemos la responsabilidad de ayudarles a poderlos identificar y que tengan, pues, por lo menos estrategias de cómo gestionarlos, de tal forma que incrementemos su capacidad de respuesta. Es poco probable que les pasen, y coincido totalmente con el ISCE, versus los beneficios enormes del proceso de transformación digital. Vale la pena invitarlos y asumir estos riesgos, pero sí creo que es muy importante que trabajemos en fortalecer y anticipar, fortalecer a las MYPES y ayudarles a anticipar los posibles riesgos para que estén mejor preparados para ellos, ¿no? Al final del día son riesgos que ya tenemos identificados, hay estrategias de mitigación, todo el mundo está haciendo esfuerzos importantes, el gobierno para tener marcos legales que protejan mejor, los proveedores de servicios financieros para tener sistemas más seguros y generar esta confianza, pero sí estar conscientes de, para mí la gran preocupación sería si subimos a este mundo digital, a la MYPE, y enfrentan algún tipo de problema y no lo logran resolver, los vamos a dejar peor que como estaban antes de nuestras intervenciones, ¿no? O sea, ahí hay una gran responsabilidad. Y a lo mejor puede ser nada más que simplemente reforzamos su desconfianza en el sistema financiero y su miedo en la tecnología y dejan de utilizar las herramientas. Y ya para mí eso es una pérdida importante, quitarles esa oportunidad de poder ser beneficiario de todo esto. Pero peor aún si, por ejemplo, caen en un tema de pérdidas más altas, de afectación de su patrimonio, de riesgos fiscales, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces yo reforzaría esa parte y es el trabajo que viene haciendo Fundación Capital. Nos hemos enfocado fuertemente en los procesos de inducción digital para tratar de prevenir esto y que los beneficios pues se derramen con un mayor impacto en la micro y pequeña empresa.
Muchas gracias. Elise, ¿algunas palabras finales?
Well, Blanca put it so eloquently. I don't have much more to add to that, but I think it's just to say, you know, digitalization is a force that's shaping the future of small businesses globally already. It's not so much a question for many small businesses of if they will digitalize or not, so much as what impact is it going to have on them? And really as Blanca was saying, our role as a support community is to ensure that we find ways to help them minimize harms and achieve equity where possible between different segments so that digitalization and the benefits of it are not happening at the expense of anyone else. So really it's about making sure that we're able to do that, and then just that we get better at learning from and sharing what we do and what does and does not work.
Great. Y bueno, pues antes de terminar, si son representantes de alguna institución que trabaje con MYPES en México, les pedimos de favor que sean parte del radar MYPE, llenando la encuesta que pueden encontrar en este código QR y que no les va a tomar ni 10 minutos. Este radar pues es un ejercicio de mapeo de todas las instituciones que interactúan con MYPES en México y queremos que todas las instituciones sean parte de él. Entonces les pido encarecidamente que llenen la encuesta si es que no lo han hecho ahora. Y Elise y Blanca, pues ha sido un placer conversar con ustedes hoy a nombre de la red de aprendizaje de Strive de BFA Global. Les agradecemos muchísimo su participación y también agradecemos a todas y todos ustedes el habernos acompañado el día de hoy y pues esperamos que la temática haya sido de su interés. Al salir del Zoom les va a aparecer una encuesta muy rápida que les vamos a pedir que respondan, por favor. Pues sin más, les esperamos en la próxima exploración a finales de agosto. Muchísimas gracias. Hasta luego.
Gracias.